When the phonograph was primarily used for domestic conversation prior to 1920, there was a profound admiration for the great music that came out during that time. Famous singers from that era included Henry Burr, Byron J. Harand, Bing Calman, and Billy Murray. Fame befell Tiny Tim in the 60s. He wed a girl who was 17 years old in front of 45 million viewers on The Tonight Show. However, Tiny Tim's peculiar decline did not end there. All it took was one shocking night for him to be fired from TV for good. His obsession with adult diapers, his incessant need to be on stage, and the insulting Christmas song. This strange and tragic story was kept from you by them. New York City is the site of Ernest Brosco's birth on April 12, 1932. Tiny Tim was his nickname. His tailor father Brosco was originally from Beirut. A Catholic priest of Maronite origin fathered him. His mother was Tilly Staff. She was a garment worker and a Polish Jew. In 1914, she departed from Brest-Litovsk and arrived in the U.S. Washington Heights was a hub for people from all over the world who were seeking employment. Herbert was never interested in ordinary things, despite their best efforts to ensure he had a good life. Even though other kids his age were playing outside, he was engrossed in music. At the age of 5, his father brought home a wind-up turntable and a 78 revolutions per minute record of Beautiful Ohio by Henry Burr. That one song was the catalyst that set everything in motion. He listened to it endlessly, captivated by it every time. The music was only part of it. The emotions it evoked and the reality it created were equally important. When he was 6 years old, he began teaching himself guitar. Hearing Arthur Godfrey play the ukulele on the radio a few years later made him go completely bonkers for the instrument. He found solace in music. It was more than a mere pleasure. Herbert would lose himself in the New York Public Library's stacks of vintage phonograph records and early 20th century sheet music. He was typical of his peers in that he followed the current music trend. At the tender age of 9, he had already amassed more knowledge than the majority of academics about classic songs and musicians. His interest in classical music continued unabated. Education had never been a priority for him. George Washington High School was not his strong suit. He struggled academically and socially. Neither mathematics nor science piqued his interest. Music was his sole passion. After failing multiple times during his junior year, he ultimately decided to drop out. They were concerned for his well-being, but he had plans ahead of time. He took on odd jobs to make ends meet, but his true calling was in music. He had just discovered something that would set him apart from the crowd. Rudy Vallee, a 1920s singer, famous for his high ethereal voice, was his favorite. Hearing this, Herbert began experimenting with falsetto singing. At first it seemed strange, but then I realized it was perfect. Going forward, he characterized it as a religious experience. He couldn't have been who he was without it. It was more than a technique. However, he was aware that Herbert Corey was not an especially memorable name. In an effort to find a name that would stick, he began performing under multiple aliases. The idea that he could benefit from a proper name led him to attempt Larry Love, Derry Doo, Julian Foxglove, and Sir Timothy Timmins. They were completely ineffective. In 1960, his employer proposed a new moniker, Tiny Tim, after the fragile but hopeful Ebenezer Scrooge. The decision was ironic, despite its simplicity. Even though it was an unusual choice for someone 6'1", it worked. Someone new emerged along with the name. He wore colorful, eccentric clothing that gave him an otherworldly appearance, and he grew his hair out, neither of which were typical in the 1950s. For the sake of his idealized vision of youth and innocence, he even powdered his face white. His role was evolving from that of a musician to that of a character. Everyone had never seen anything like Tiny Tim before, what with his falsetto voice, ukulele, and traditional songs. and before long, people would begin to pay attention. In the late 1950s, Tiny Tim set out on his adventure in a seedier section of New York City. In Times Square at Hubert's Museum and Live Flea Circus, which had been operating since 1925 and cost a dime, he performed. There were sword swallowers, strange tattooed people, sideshow acts, and even a flea circus complete with actual fleas pulling miniature chariots. Even little Tim was at home. His distinctive falsetto allowed him to perform vintage Tin Pan Alley tunes as Larry Love, the singing canary. Even in a room full of strange people, he stood out at 6 feet tall with long hair and white makeup on his face. People started calling him Human Canary. Even among the different, the people at Hubert's didn't take him seriously as a musician. But he was transformed by the ordeal. He mastered the art of captivating audiences and embraced his unique quirks. After outgrowing Hubert's, he relocated to Greenwich Village in 1960 to chase his dreams. No one could say that village life was easy. Whenever an audience would have him, little Tim would perform as Sir Timothy Timms or Dardover. It took some time, but his manager George King did his best to get him noticed. He did most of his early work for free. He performed at open mic nights, tiny clubs, and even the legendary Café What, the same venue where a young Bob Dylan was launching his career. He would play for food on occasion. Page 3, a lesbian club on 7th Avenue and West 10th Street, offered him a permanent position in 1963, and that was the turning point in his life. Even though he barely made $96 per month, the club drew actual customers 6 nights a week, who enjoyed his eccentric music. Many loved his rendition of I Enjoy Being a Girl that he performed. At Page 3, he honed his skills to the point where he could sing in both baritone and falsetto simultaneously. At this point, his audience started to recognize him as an artist, rather than a sideshow performer. He was becoming more well-known in Greenwich Village, but the mainstream music industry was bewildered by him. His peculiar look and high-pitched voice led many to write him off as a novelty act. But he began to gain notice in the early 1960s, when the folk scene was flourishing, when he played at places like Café Bazaar and the Fat Black Pussycat. Scouts for talent noticed him, but they didn't know how to promote him. As soon as he set foot on the Rowan and Martin Laugh-In set in February 1960, Tiny Tim shot to fame. Thanks to its fast-paced comedy and unexpected guests, the show became one of the most watched on television. What followed was unexpected. With a ukulele and a shopping bag in his hands, little Tim strode in. Encircling his face were his lengthy curls. His identity remained a mystery to co-host Dick Martin. Tiny Tim broke into a high falsetto rendition of Tiptoe Through the Tulips, while grinning broadly. By the time his performance was over, everyone had either laughed or been stunned, but by then, nobody had been paying attention. He became famous all of a sudden because of that. His unconventional demeanor and appearance were perfectly in keeping with the era's emphasis on self-expression in the late 1960s. Not only was he a performer, but he was also completely unique. Producer George Schlatter had faith in him, even though NBC executives were uncertain about his ability to appeal to mainstream audiences. As a result of his popularity growing with each appearance, Tiny Tim was invited back as a repeat guest. He signed a recording contract with Frank Sinatra's Reprise Records later that year, thanks to his performance on Laugh-In. His first studio album, God Bless Tiny Tim, came out in April of 1960. Performed in his distinctive manner, the eclectic set included songs from the Tin Pan Alley era, vaudeville numbers, and his own compositions. The outstanding track, Tiptoe Through the Tulips, unexpectedly became a hit, penetrating the Billboard Hot 100 at number 17. Having previously collaborated with Carly Simon and Barbra Streisand, Richard Perry produced the album. Perry enriched Tiny Tim's music with lush orchestration, making it sound almost cinematic in its grandeur. While some critics lauded the album for bringing back long-forgotten American music, others thought it was funny. Unfortunately, it was well received by the general public, leading to strong album sales. Tiny Tim had become a meme by the end of 1968. Tiny Tim was a peculiar performer who made viewers of The Ed Sullivan Show, The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, and other shows question whether he was being serious or humorous. But for some, he was more than that. Even well-known singers, such as Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra, praised his extensive knowledge of early American songs. Andy Warhol and Bob Dylan also saw him as an artist revitalizing classic American songs. He was viewed by some as nothing more than a surrealist who happened to strike it rich. Regardless, he gained widespread attention and everyone watched, whether they were rooting for him or making fun of him. With over 20 appearances between 1968 and the early 1970s, Tiny Tim was a legendary guest on Johnny Carson's The Tonight Show. Everything changed in April 1968 when he made his first appearance. Carson unveiled God Bless Tiny Tim, his debut album, which immediately sold over 200,000 copies. His unanticipated single Tiptoe Through the Tulips peaked at #17 on Billboard's Hot 100. She was unlike anyone else they had ever seen before, standing at 6 feet 1 inch tall, with long hair and a falsetto voice. As a strange and talented musician, he played traditional ukulele tunes. His antics were so captivating that Carson appeared torn between delight and astonishment. There was a severe lack of supply. Tiny Tim began making frequent appearances on the show after NBC received numerous letters requesting more. Carson thought Tiny Tim was a great way to liven up the program. Unpredictable was he. Every time he spoke, it was as if he were saying something entirely different. An aria from the 1940s would be playing in the background the next. This necessitated treating him as a guest. While some adored him, others couldn't tell if he was being sincere or not. Regardless of the circumstances, he remained one of the most talked about figures of that era. By the mid-1970s, things had changed. Tiny Tim lost some of its appeal as rock and popular pop became more popular. The frequency of his appearances on The Tonight Show decreased, and his star began to wane. Nevertheless, throughout their time together, they achieved history. December 17, 1960, was the finest day of Tiny Tim's life so far. On air during The Tonight Show, he wed Miss Vicky Budinger, a 17-year-old contestant. On television, it was unique. A quarter of the American population, roughly 45 million people, watched the show simultaneously. It was the moon landing that attracted the most viewers. Carson emphasized its veracity to ensure that everyone understood. People thought we were joking about Tiny Tim getting married on the show, but we are not. He informed the audience during his monologue that night. Thousands of Dutch tulips adorned the stage, and Carson served the happy couple milk and honey as a toast, per Tiny Tim's request. There was a rumor that the crime rate dropped that night, due to the large number of people staying home to watch the wedding. Even though his marriage didn't endure, Tiny Tim went on to claim that he was the country's most talented individual. He and Miss Vicky ended their 8-year relationship. They had one kid together before they broke up. Despite the breakup, their wedding remains a landmark in television history. Carson cherished Little Tim. Having some guests was entertaining or interesting, but Tiny Tim was always given plenty of time to speak. His knowledge of early 20th century music was extensive, and he could go on and on about obscure songs and music. In turn, Carson appeared to appreciate this, and frequently allowed him to express his excitement to the audience. Carson could also be surprised in a delightful way by Tiny Tim. He left Carson momentarily speechless when he announced his engagement to Miss Vicky during one of their visits. It didn't matter how out of the ordinary things got, Carson kept things light-hearted and allowed Tiny Tim to be. Carson appeared to be watching out for him as well. Carson ensured that Tiny Tim's eccentric behavior never escalated into rudeness, even though the audience members found it amusing. Tiny Tim's performances were even more remarkable because it was humorous and considered all at once. By the late 1970s, Tiny Tim had faded from prominence. His show, which was once fresh and exciting, struggled to keep up with the times. Despite the end of his major TV series, he continued acting in smaller venues such as community halls and circuses. The most painful part was when Reprise Records let him go. Without a record label to support him, his success swiftly declined. Instead of giving up, he sought to create his own destiny. In 1971, he founded Victim Records, a name he shared with his Miss Vicky. Within a year, the label had released 5 tracks, but not a single one had achieved commercial success. Victim Records closed its doors because the plan was a bust.